What if your anxiety wasn't trying to ruin your life, but trying to save it? What if the pounding heart, the racing thoughts, the shaky breath, weren't signs of failure, but messages from a part of you that never learned how to speak? You've been taught to silence it, to crush it with logic, to medicate it, to breathe through it, to escape it. But what if the real problem was never your anxiety? What if the real problem was your relationship to it? Imagine this. You're sitting alone in your room. It's quiet. Nothing dangerous is happening. But suddenly your chest tightens. Your mind floods with thoughts that don't seem to belong to the moment. You try to shake it off, tell yourself you're being dramatic. But your body doesn't listen. Because the body remembers what the mind refuses to. It doesn't matter that you're safe now. It doesn't matter that it's irrational. Something inside you is still sounding the alarm. Not because you're broken, but because something went unheard for far too long. And here's the paradox. You've labeled anxiety as a disorder, a malfunction. But what if it's none of those things? What if it's your body's final attempt to get your attention? What if every anxious episode is not a malfunction but a flare? A signal from the subconscious depths of you, pointing to something buried, something you haven't acknowledged, something you were never taught to feel safely? So the question isn't, how do I make it stop? It's, what is it trying to say? You've likely been at war with your own nervous system for years, blaming it, shaming it, forcing it to perform. And every time it collapses under the pressure, you call it weakness. But what if that collapse is a kind of wisdom? What if anxiety is the language of your inner truth? One that only emerges when your thinking mind is no longer capable of suppressing what your soul has been carrying? You keep searching for solutions, quick fixes, coping tools, productivity hacks. But deep down, you know this is not about efficiency. It's about survival. It's about recognition. Because nothing screams louder than the parts of you that were told to stay silent. So now here you are, trying to manage symptoms of something you haven't even named. And maybe, just maybe, your anxiety isn't asking for management. It's asking for witnessing. Anxiety doesn't begin in the mind. It begins in the body, in the nervous system, in the hidden archives of memory that don't use words, only sensation. By the time your thoughts start spiraling, your body has already spoken. You didn't hear it, but you felt it, the shallow breath, the clenched jaw, the tension behind your eyes. And because you were never taught to listen to these signals, your mind rushes in to fill the silence with noise, with stories, with panic, with shame. You tell yourself, I'm overreacting. But your body doesn't lie. You say, nothing's wrong. But your nervous system responds as if something is deeply unsafe. This is the root of the disconnection. The belief that anxiety is a malfunction of the brain, rather than a message from the self. But where does this message come from? Let's go deeper. In childhood, your brain begins learning what's safe and what's not just based on your experiences but on what you were allowed to express. If sadness wasn't safe in your home, you learned to shut it down. If anger led to rejection, you buried it. If your pain was dismissed, you stopped bringing it forward. But none of it disappeared. It simply moved underground. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we exile in order to survive. And here's the cruel twist. Everything you push down to appear normal doesn't vanish. It waits. It leaks. It disguises itself. And often, it returns as anxiety. Because anxiety is not one single thing. It's a signal of conflict. An inner war between the self you've been forced to be, and the self that's still trying to exist underneath. Imagine it like this. There's a child version of you trapped in time. They never got to say what they needed. They never felt safe. They're banging on the walls of your chest not to scare you, but to remind you they're still there. And every time you ignore them, the banging grows louder. This is what anxiety often is, a visitation from an unfelt truth. But society doesn't teach us to feel. It teaches us to perform. You're trained to regulate your image, not your nervous system. You're rewarded for being composed, functional, efficient, even if your inner world is collapsing. This is why so many high-functioning people feel like they're dying inside. Their external life is under control. Their calendar is color-coded. They hit their deadlines. But their inner world is flooded with noise they've never been taught to translate. Anxiety becomes the byproduct of emotional suppression, not because you are weak, but because you have learned to abandon yourself in order to belong. Think of it this way. If you were punished for crying as a child, your body learned. Emotions are dangerous. Feelings make me unsafe. So now, as an adult, when you begin to feel deeply, your system interprets that vulnerability as threat. And what happens when a threat is detected? Fight, flight, freeze. Or, Overthinking, overcontrolling, overanalyzing. You're not defective. You're dysregulated. Gabor Mate puts it this way: anxiety is not a disease, it's a normal response to abnormal experiences. So the question becomes, what abnormal emotional experiences have you normalized? What silence did you learn to live with? What pain did you intellectualize because feeling it was too dangerous? Here lies the philosophical contradiction. You believe your anxiety is the problem, when in truth, it's the proof that something sacred within you is still alive, still trying to speak, still asking to be felt. And the more you fight it, the louder it becomes. Arthur Schopenhauer said that suffering arises not from pain itself, but from the resistance to it. When you resist the message, you trap it. When you lean in, something shifts. So ask yourself, what if your anxiety isn't asking for medication or management, but for presence? What if it doesn't want to be fixed? It wants to be heard? We've spent decades pathologizing discomfort, calling it disorder, diagnosing it as brokenness. But sometimes the ache is not dysfunction. Sometimes the ache is truth. And anxiety is truth with no voice. It is the whisper beneath the scream, the unfinished sentence of your nervous system, the consequence of living in a world that told you to survive instead of feel. But once you understand what anxiety really is, you stop asking how to get rid of it, and you start asking, what is this moment trying to show me? Because when you listen closely enough, every signal has a story. You may not see it happening. But anxiety, unheard, misunderstood, mislabeled, doesn't just disrupt your mind. It rewires your entire life. Slowly, quietly, in ways you don't even recognize. You begin to make choices not based on what you want, but on what feels safest. You stay quiet in conversations not because you have nothing to say, but because you're terrified of being misunderstood. You plan for every possible outcome not because you're prepared, but because you're convinced something will go wrong. You decline invitations, delay decisions, second-guess everything, and then call it being careful. But caution is not the same as clarity. And safety, when distorted by anxiety, becomes a prison disguised as logic. And here's the thing most people miss. Anxiety doesn't just affect your thoughts. It affects your identity. You start to believe that you are anxious, rather than realizing anxiety is something you're experiencing. It becomes your lens, the filter through which you see relationships, work, even love. You begin to build a life that feels tolerable instead of one that feels true. You make yourself small in rooms you should have owned. You stay in situations that slowly suffocate your joy just because they feel familiar. You begin to confuse numbness with calm. And perhaps most dangerously, you normalize the feeling of being on edge, of clenching your jaw, of shallow breathing, of bracing for impact even when there's no threat. This becomes your baseline. And over time, the body forgets what peace feels like. Neurologically, the constant activation of your fight or flight system wires your brain to detect danger everywhere. Even in silence, stillness, love. Even in joy. So when someone tells you, just relax, they don't realize that your nervous system sees relaxation as vulnerability, a trap, not a relief. And so the cycle continues. You anticipate disaster so you can avoid disappointment. You don't trust happiness because it feels unstable. You micromanage your emotions like landmines, hoping you won't set anything off. This is not just exhausting. It's dehumanizing. Because you weren't born this way. You became this way by learning that safety is not a feeling but a performance. And that performance has consequences. It costs you connection. It dulls your creativity. It steals your ability to be present with the people you love, and worst of all, it disconnects you from yourself. This is the unseen consequence of unhealed anxiety. You begin to mistrust your own peace. And if you can't trust peace, you'll never truly feel free. But what if that could change? What if anxiety wasn't the enemy, but the invitation? Not a disorder to conquer, but a messenger to meet? What if the fear you've been trying to silence is actually trying to guide you home? You don't need to be saved. You need to remember who you were before fear became your compass. Breaking free from anxiety isn't about fixing yourself. It's about learning how to re-inhabit your life, without filtering every moment through the lens of fear. And here's the paradox. You will never outthink anxiety. Because anxiety is not a thought problem. It's a safety problem. You overthink because you don't feel safe. You seek control because uncertainty feels dangerous. You avoid rest because stillness reminds your body of times when silence meant punishment, or absence meant abandonment. So the rebellion begins here. Not with more control, but with permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to feel without fixing. Permission to stay present when your instinct is to flee into thought. This isn't about empty affirmations. This is about retraining your nervous system to believe what your mind already knows, that you are not in danger anymore. Start small. When the anxiety hits, don't try to escape it. Witness it. Say inwardly, "This is my body remembering." Not, "I'm losing it." Not, "Something's wrong." Just, "This is a memory surfacing through sensation." Then breathe. Not shallow. Deep into your belly. Inhale through the nose for 4 seconds. Hold. Exhale through the mouth for 6. Again. And again. Because breath is the first language your body understands. Then bring awareness to your feet. The ground. Gravity. Let your attention drop from your mind to your body. You cannot spiral when you're anchored. This is how the cycle breaks. Not with perfection. Not with control. But with presence. You may not realize it, but every time you choose to feel your feelings instead of thinking about them, you're reclaiming sovereignty over your life. And over time your body begins to trust you again. Not because the anxiety vanishes, but because it no longer owns you. Viktor Frankl wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. In our choice lies our growth and our freedom." That space is where anxiety either hijacks you, or heals you. But to access it, you must resist the urge to escape yourself. To override. To numb. To perform. Because true healing doesn't come from running from the storm. It comes from learning how to stand in the middle of it without abandoning yourself. This is not easy. But it's human. It's sacred. And it's yours. Because the rebellion isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's in the moment you finally choose to stay with yourself. When every part of you wants to run. That's not weakness. That's power. That's healing. That's the moment anxiety stops being your enemy and starts becoming your compass. Here is the truth your anxiety has been trying to tell you all along. You were never meant to carry it alone. Your anxiety was never the enemy. It was your body's last line of defense. Its way of screaming, "Something is not being heard." And for most of your life, you've responded to that scream by silencing it. You called it overreacting. You called it weakness. You called it disorder. But anxiety is not disorder. It's disconnection. Disconnection from your breath. From your body. From your truth. And once you realize that, everything begins to shift. You stop asking, "How do I get rid of this?" And you start asking, "What is this showing me about how I've been living?" Because here's what no one tells you. Sometimes, anxiety is the signal that you're finally feeling something that's been waiting for years to rise. Sometimes, anxiety is your boundary detector, telling you when something doesn't feel right, even when it looks perfect on paper. Sometimes, anxiety is the part of you that never gave up hope that your pain mattered. And when you stop fighting it, when you stop labeling it as failure, when you stop trying to dominate it with willpower and logic, you begin to hear the wisdom inside the noise. You begin to realize that the moment you stop abandoning yourself in fear, you stop giving anxiety a reason to scream. Because here's the final truth. You don't need to be fearless to feel free. You just need to stop running from what wants to be felt. Anxiety loses its power the moment you turn toward it with compassion instead of control. It doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be translated. And when it is, it becomes a guide, a compass, a voice, not of destruction but of direction. It says, "You've strayed too far from your truth. You've been silencing yourself again. You're abandoning your needs. You're accepting less than you deserve. You're living from the head, while the heart is starving." And the moment you begin listening, truly listening, you stop living in fear of anxiety, and start living in alignment with the deeper intelligence within you. This doesn't mean the signals won't come back. They will. But now, you'll understand their language. Now you'll trust the signal. Because it will no longer feel like an enemy you have to fight. It will feel like yourself, finally speaking. And when you truly hear yourself, you no longer feel lost. You begin to return. To your body. To your presence. To your power. You stop surviving your life. And begin inhabiting it. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time in a long time, you'll exhale. And realize you're finally home.